Welcome to the historic blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe. Not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. We will now begin with Story 1. God's Viceroys, the Rise of Bishops as Feudal Lords. You awake in the flickering candlelight of a drafty stone hall in the 9th century. The air smells faintly of parchment and damp wool. Before you stands not a nobleman, nor a warlord but a bishop. And not just a man of prayer, but a landholder, a judge, and a political operative. Let us begin. The merging of thrones and altars. In the early Middle Ages, following the fragmentation of the Western Roman Empire, Europe was not so much a continent of countries as it was a patchwork of territories held together by fealty, faith, and famine. Central authority was rare, and power often fell to those who could muster loyalty and manage land nobles, warlords, and surprisingly often bishops. You might imagine the early medieval bishop as a man dressed in fine ecclesiastical robes, presiding over Holy Mass in a grand cathedral. That image is not wrong but incomplete. This man was also likely to have held a sword once in his life, managed estates, commanded militias, and settled feuds. These bishops were appointed not just for their piety, but for their political usefulness. The story begins in the shadow of collapsing Roman infrastructure. Cities were shrinking, roads decaying, and institutions vanishing. What remained in many places was the church. Dioceses, which once paralleled Roman administrative districts, became the default governance model. The bishop's palace became the administrative hub. The cathedral chapter replaced the city council, and in many cases, the bishop himself became the de facto governor. But how did it happen? How did these spiritual figures acquire temporal power? The donation of Constantine and its lingering ghost. One cannot overstate the ideological power of forged documents in medieval history. One of the most important, the donation of Constantine, appeared in the 8th century. This document claimed that Emperor Constantine granted authority over Rome and the western part of the empire to Pope Sylvester I. It was later exposed as a forgery, but not until the Renaissance. In the meantime, it served as a powerful justification for ecclesiastical authority in temporal matters. Popes used it to claim authority over emperors. Bishops, in turn, cited the Pope's authority to legitimize their roles not just in the church, but also in matters of secular governance. The blurred line between divine and royal right was not a mistake, it was policy. Charlemagne and the Bishop Kingmakers. Charlemagne, crowned emperor in 800 AD, understood the power of bishops. He used them like administrators, issuing royal decrees through them, charging them with tax collection, and giving them lands in exchange for loyalty. They were literate, obedient, and not hereditary, thus a more controllable elite than the secular nobility. The church became a bureaucracy he could trust, at least more than the warlords. Many bishops during this time held immunities, meaning their lands were exempt from royal interference. They could collect taxes, hold courts, and raise militias without interference from local counts or dukes. These were not privileges granted lightly, or the price paid for loyalty and service. As Charlemagne's empire fragmented after his death, the power of bishops only increased. In the chaos of inheritance and civil war, they were the stable core in many regions. From shepherds to feudal lords. By the 10th and 11th centuries, bishops and abbots held vast tracts of land, sometimes rivaling kings. The Bishop of Durham in England, for example, held secular powers akin to a king within his territory, including raising armies, minting coins, and administering justice. These men were sometimes referred to as prince-bishops, a term that encapsulates the bizarre duality of their role. They were celibate spiritual leaders, yes, but also lords who rode in armor, negotiated with kings, and collected rents from peasants. Their cathedrals were often the grandest buildings in the region, not only places of worship, but centers of administration and wealth storage. They had treasuries, archives, and sometimes even dungeons. How did ordinary people see these figures? To a peasant, the bishop was a towering figure both feared and revered. He might excommunicate you or absolve your sins. He might send you to war or bless your crops. His very presence blurred the spiritual and political lines. Clerical appointments, the hidden politics. To control a bishopric was to control a region. Thus, kings and nobles fought bitterly over who could appoint bishops. This led directly into what would become the investiture controversy, a topic we will explore in another story. For now, know that even minor bishop appointments often involved bribes, favors, or threats. The church was supposed to be above such things, but in practice, appointments were deeply political. A noble family might push one of its sons into a bishopric to secure influence. A king might place a loyal advisor in a powerful diocese to control the local nobility. A monastery might seek independence by aligning with a strong bishop. The maneuverings were intricate, quiet, and long-lasting, very essence of boring history. The case of Bishop Adalbero of Leon. Let us pause on a lesser-known figure, Bishop Adalbero of Leon, who lived in the 10th century. He was a vocal critic of royal corruption and a powerful advocate for church reform. But he was also a shrewd political operator who maneuvered through the intrigues of the French royal court with skill. He once said, "The king reigns, but he does not govern." Adalbero was part of a movement that believed the church should guide the state, not the other way around. He took this belief to heart, influencing royal decisions, managing estates, and playing kingmaker in regional politics. Yet he also maintained a strict commitment to liturgy and reform. His life shows us that the bishop's role was not simplate, was a constant balancing act between the holy and the profane. The quiet power of paper. One of the least glamorous but most powerful tools bishops used was the written record. Documents, charters, and letters meticulously copied by scribes gave bishops legal weight. If a lord questioned a landholding, a bishop could present a document sealed by a long-dead king. The church kept better records than most noble houses. That gave it not only continuity, but authority. What was written and sealed became law. The average peasant would not see such documents, but he lived under their shadow. His rents, his rights, even his marriage might be dictated by what was inked in a bishop's scriptorium. A system built to endure. By the High Middle Ages, the image of a bishop as a warrior cleric, a political tactician, and an estate manager was firmly entrenched. Cathedrals rose in stone, laws were written in Latin, and power was measured as much in parchment as in people. Yet this system, for all its stability, created friction. What happened when kings wanted to appoint their own bishops? What occurred when two bishops claimed the same land? When the lines blurred too much, conflict was inevitable. And that leads us to a question. When does sacred authority become political tyranny? And who gets to decide the difference? As the morning mist lifts over a walled town, a rider approaches. He carries not news from the battlefield or a royal missive, but a papal letter addressed to the bishop who rules here as firmly as any baron. He is spiritual shepherd, but also judge, landlord, and sometimes general. How did such a fusion of authority persist, and at what cost? Let us now trace the evolution of this dual role. The architecture of authority. In the 11th century, the cathedral city was not just a place of worship, it was a hub of regional control. At its center stood the cathedral itself, towering stone, expensive stained glass, and a floorplan designed as much to awe as to serve God. Adjoining it were buildings that formed the bishop's administrative compound treasuries, scriptoriums, and audience chambers. Here the bishop held court. His decisions had the weight of both secular and divine law. His staff included archdeacons, who acted like county officials, and canons, who managed finances, supervised property, and administered charity, though charity often involved managing laborers on church estates. The bishopric operated like a lordship, except it answered to two masters, the crown and the pope, and sometimes to neither. The sword of the Spiritan, sometimes steel. Though canon law prohibited clergy from shedding blood, the church had ways of circumventing this rule. Bishops could appoint military officials, vassals to act on their behalf. These men led troops, enforced boundaries, and defended church lands from rival nobles or invaders. In some cases, bishops themselves rode into battle. The most famous example may be Odo of Bayeux, half-brother to William the Conqueror. Though a bishop, Odo fought with sword and shield during the Norman conquest and later managed vast lands in England. The sword of the church was both literal and symbolic. Bishops wielded influence that could make or break royal ambitions. In many regions, they were the only power strong enough to challenge a local baron or stand up to a weak king. The investiture controversy begins to boil. By the late 11th century, this balance of sacred and secular power reached a breaking point. Kings, particularly the Holy Roman Emperors, sought to appoint bishops loyal to themselves. After all, a bishop held land and meant was too risky to let the Pope decide who filled the seat. But the papacy, especially under Pope Gregory VII, began to push back. Reformers within the church demanded independence from lay interference. Their goal was to separate the sacred from the secular, ending simony, the buying of offices, and lay investiture, appointment by secular rulers. The resulting investiture controversy pitted pope against emperor, bishop against noble, and ultimately redefined the church's role in governance. But even before that drama reached its peak, individual bishops had to navigate treacherous political waters. The long rule of Bishop Otto of Bamberg. Take Bishop Otto of Bamberg, a figure lesser known outside academic circles, but significant in the 12th century. Otto served as bishop for over 4 decades in the German Duchy of Franconia. He was not a revolutionary. He was, above all, a manager. Otto balanced the expectations of the Holy Roman Emperor, the papacy, and his own canons with skill. His episcopate was marked by economic reform, the building of roads and bridges, and the quiet cultivation of monastic networks that helped stabilize the region. Otto also led missionary work in Pomerania, which brought new territories under the influence of the Church and the Empire. Though he did not fight himself, his efforts were backed by military campaigns. His biography reveals a pattern. Bishops often served as the administrative wing of conquest, not by sword, but by parchment. Tensions in the English Church. Across the Channel, England was experiencing its own ecclesiastical evolution. After the Norman conquest, bishops were largely drawn from Norman aristocracy. They were trusted allies of the king, but also loyal to the church. In Durham, the bishop was given palatinate powers, meaning he ruled like a prince, independent of the crown. This arrangement was practical. Durham was a frontier region near Scotland, and royal authority was weak. The church filled the gap. However, such powers made bishops difficult to control. When conflicts arose between the English crown and the church, such as the struggle between King Henry II and Archbishop Thomas Becket, stemmed from this fundamental contradiction. A bishop was expected to obey both Rome and the king, even when they opposed one another. Bureaucracy from the cloister. Behind every bishop was an army not of soldiers, but of scribes, secretaries, and scholars. The cathedral chapter, a body of clerics attached to the cathedral, served as an internal council. These were educated men, often with legal training, who handled property records, legal cases, and correspondence. They were the equivalent of a medieval civil service. In some dioceses, the bishop would rarely make a decision without consulting them, and their loyalty could be fickle. If a bishop became unpopular or challenged the rights of the chapter, he might face resistance not by force, but by ink and seal. This bureaucracy made the church resilient. When kings fell, when cities burned, the diocesan records endured. They provided continuity in a world often lacking it. The cost of dual allegiances. But the bishop's dual role came with costs. Spiritual responsibilities could be neglected in favor of political ones. Parish priests might go unsupervised, and pastoral care might take a back seat to estate management. Critics from within the church, especially monastic reformers, decried the wealth and worldliness of bishops. Movements like the Cluniac and later Cistercian reforms called for a return to purity, simplicity, and spiritual focus. Their rise would challenge the very system that had made bishops so powerful. Even kings began to question whether bishops could serve two masters. Was a bishop an agent of the divine or a feudal vassal? Could he be both? A fragile equilibrium. The arrangement persisted because it worked for a while. The church provided kings with literate administrators. In exchange, the church gained protection, land, and influence, but it was never a stable equilibrium. When a bishop died, the question of succession could spark fierce contest. When one sought to reform his diocese, he might face resistance from local nobility or even his own cathedral chapter. When he sided with Rome, he might anger the king. When he sided with the king, he might face century or worse, excommunication. Each bishop had to navigate these waters personally. Some succeeded. Others were removed, imprisoned, or quietly retired. The bishopric as a career path. By the 12th century, being a bishop was one of the most powerful careers in Christendom. Young clerics, often from noble families, were educated in cathedral schools with the hope of one day attaining such office. The process of becoming a bishop called election, though often it was anything but, was highly political. Votes were cast, favors exchanged, and papal approval sought. Kings sometimes forced appointments. Popes sometimes overrode them. Even among churchmen, the office was seen not only as a calling, but as a position of immense influence. The spiritual justification often followed after the political realities. The unquiet grave of Bishop Walcher. Let us conclude this section with the story of Bishop Walcher, another bishop of Durham. In 1080, Walcher was murdered by local Northumbrian nobles. He had tried to govern both spiritually and politically, but failed to maintain peace between the Norman overlords and the native population. His death marked a failure of the system, a warning that no amount of sanctity could shield a man from the realities of feudal politics. It was not the last such failure. And so we ask, can an institution built for salvation ever truly govern the earthly needs of power, land, and blood? Or must one side always win out in the end? It is the twilight of the High Middle Ages. In a stone room filled with scrolls, a weary bishop signs a letter to the Pope, requesting clarity on a matter of law. Outside, peasants labor on church lands. Somewhere nearby, a noble plots to challenge his authority. The bishop Psyche's burden is not just spiritual but profoundly political, and increasingly it is under siege. Now we turn to the slow unraveling of the church's feudal dominance. The Gregorian reform and the rise of papal centralization. By the 11th century, reform movements within the church sought to address corruption, simony, and secular interference. These efforts culminated in what historians call the Gregorian Reform, named after Pope Gregory VII. Gregory believed that the church should be free from lay control, and that bishops should be appointed by ecclesiastical authorities alone. He went further, claiming that the Pope had the authority to depose emperors. It was a revolutionary idea, not in the streets but in the chancelleries. This set the stage for the investiture controversy, a power struggle between Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV of the Holy Roman Empire. The showdown at Canossa. In 1077, Henry IV, having been excommunicated by Gregory, made a dramatic journey across the Alps to the fortress of Canossa, where the Pope was staying. There, he famously stood barefoot in the snow for 3 days, begging absolution. While this act has often been romanticized, it was a complex political performance. Henry was trying to regain authority by publicly submitting to the Pope, while Gregory sought to reinforce the principle that only the Church could appoint bishops. The Canossa incident didn't resolve the conflict, it only dramatized it. For decades afterward, bishops remained torn between obedience to the Pope and loyalty to their secular overlords. Many were caught in the middle and suffered for it. Concordats and compromises. The Concordat of Worms in 1122 finally brought a formal resolution to the investiture controversy. It established a compromise. Bishops would be elected by the Church, but the emperor could be present and bestow secular authority. This split the office in two: spiritual authority from Rome, temporal authority from the emperor. In theory, it preserved the balance. In practice, it complicated everything. Bishops were now more accountable to Rome, but they still had to navigate local feudal obligations. Their role as vassals didn't disappear. The Church became more centralized, yes, but the bishop's dual identity remained unresolved. The silent strength of cathedral chapters. As papal authority grew, cathedral chapters, bodies of clergy that advised bishops also, became more assertive. They often resisted reforms from Rome, particularly those that reduced their privileges or wealth. In some cases, chapters outright refused to accept papal appointments or delayed them for years. Elections were disputed. Court cases were brought before papal tribunals. The governance of a diocese could grind to a halt over seemingly minor details, yet these details affected everything from tax collection to war funding. What began as a movement for reform became mired in legalism, as bishops and chapters learned to use canon law for their own ends. Bureaucracy thickened, decisions slowed, power remained but it calcified. The bishops and the Magna Carta. In England, bishops played an important though often overlooked role in the development of constitutional limits on royal authority. Stephen Langton, Archbishop of Canterbury, was one of the chief architects of the Magna Carta in 1215. Langton insisted that the Church's liberties be protected from royal interference. Clause 1 of the Magna Carta guaranteed freedom of the English Church. This was not just spiritual freedom, it was a defense of the Church's right to govern itself, including appointing its own bishops. Ironically, this placed bishops in the same category as barons, defenders of local rights against centralized power. Their role in governance was becoming more legalistic, more institutional, and, slowly, less feudal. The rise of mendicants and the shift in authority. As the 13th century progressed, new movements emerged within the Church, most notably the Franciscans and Dominicans. These mendicant orders rejected wealth, land, and political power, emphasizing poverty and preaching. To many, they were a return to true Christian values. To bishops, they were a quiet threat. These new orders operated independently of diocesan structures. They reported directly to the Pope, bypassing the traditional hierarchy. They preached in towns and cities, drawing crowds and building reputations. Their popularity highlighted a growing disillusionment with the episcopal elite. Bishops were seen sometimes rightly as distant landlords, more concerned with rents and lawsuits than souls. The moral authority of the episcopacy began to erode, even as its legal powers remained intact. Bishops and the Black Death. Then came the Black Death in the mid-14th century. The plague did not spare the clergy. In fact, many bishops, abbots, and priests died in great numbers as they tended to the sick and buried the dead. Diocesan governance was disrupted. Parishes were left vacant. Monasteries emptied. Bishops had to scramble to refill positions and manage chaos. The population collapse undermined feudal structures. With fewer laborers, peasants could demand better conditions. The church, reliant on a steady income from land, struggled to adapt. Bishops lost not only revenue but authority. Their courts were less respected, their lands less productive, their role as landlords more tenuous. The long decline had begun. From landlords to administrators. By the 15th century, the nature of episcopal power was changing. Bishops were increasingly appointed for their legal skills or connections, not their piety. Many were career administrators who moved between posts, never settling long enough to build spiritual communities. Secular rulers regained influence over appointments. In France, the Gallican Church promoted royal control. In England, monarchs like Henry VIII would later break from Rome entirely, turning bishops into state officials. What had once been a delicate balancing act became subordination. Bishops were no longer lords among lords, they were servants of the state, or functionaries of a distant pope. A final glimpse, the Bishop of Ely. In late medieval England, the Bishop of Ely still held one of the richest sees in the country. His palace in London, Ely Place, was so grand that even royalty stayed there. Yet by the 15th century, his lands were managed by stewards. His court was run by lawyers. His decisions passed through layers of bureaucracy. The image of the warrior cleric had faded. What remained was the bishop as paper sovereign, still powerful, but abstracted. His role was symbolic, administrative, and often ceremonial. His voice might be heard in Parliament but not on the battlefield. He was respected, yes, but feared no longer. Endings in echo. And so the age of the bishop-lord fade not with a great clash of swords, but under the slow weight of law, reform, plague, and change. The medieval bishop had stood at a crossroads between heaven and earth. For centuries, he had held a unique form of power, both sacred and profane, spiritual and administrative. He had governed villages and cities, judged disputes, raised armies, and crowned kings. But over time, that role was narrowed. Specialized bureaucracies, stronger monarchies, new orders, and evolving theology made his dual identity untenable. The bishop remained, but the Lord slowly vanished. Was it inevitable that the spiritual would lose to the political? Or did the church itself choose this path, in seeking to govern what could never truly be ruled? Story 2. Monasteries and Manuscripts, How Scribes Governed Through Ink. The bell tolls softly across a foggy field. A line of black-robed monks files silently into the scriptorium, each carrying a blank piece of parchment. They will spend the next 12 hours in silence, hunched over desks, copying legal codes, royal letters, and biblical texts. Outside, the world moves with war and politics. Inside, it moves with ink and intent. Now we turn to the quiet empire of scribes, the monks, who governed through the power of the written word. A hidden engine of governance. When we think of medieval governance, we imagine kings in castles, bishops in cathedrals, or knights in armor. But hidden beneath these more visible figures were men whose names were rarely remembered: monastic scribes. In an age before printing, these monks were information processors, legal transcribers, historians, and record keepers. And their work, quiet, methodical, and deeply boring, shaped how kingdoms functioned. Charters, laws, deeds, treaties, censuses, and annals all flowed through monastic scriptoria. Without these scribes, governance would have been blind and mute. The monastery as bureaucratic hub. A monastery was more than a religious sanctuary. It was a center of administration, a storage house of memory, and a workshop of knowledge. Larger monasteries had entire departments dedicated to producing documents. The scriptorium, often a long, narrow room with windows designed to let in soft light, was the nerve center. Each scribe worked at a slanted desk with ink, quills, and painstaking discipline. There were rules: silence, minimal movement, focus. This wasn't merely spiritual devotion, it was statecraft. Monks copied royal charters confirming land grants. They documented episcopal decrees. They transcribed canon law. And in doing so, they preserved the legal foundations of the medieval world. The rule of St. Benedict and the value of labor. The foundation for much of this came from the rule of St. Benedict, written in the 6th century. Benedict's guidance encouraged a life of ora et labora, prayer and work. Copying texts was seen as a worthy form of labor, one that contributed to both personal discipline and communal stability. In this view, the monk was not just a servant of God, but a servant of order. Every letter, every margin note, every rubrication, the red letter headings in texts, was part of a broader system of record-keeping. And it was this record-keeping that allowed kings and lords to enforce their claims, bishops to manage their sees, and peasants to plead their rights if they could afford to. Charters, land, and legitimacy. One of the most critical documents produced by monastic scribes was the Charter of Formal, written record that detailed land ownership, obligations, and rights. These charters were usually requested by kings, bishops, or noble lords. A typical charter might begin with a solemn invocation, followed by a declaration of intent. Know that I, Lord Robert, grant to the Abbey of St. Mary, and then detail the land, boundaries, and conditions. Once written, these documents were sealed, stored, and sometimes recopied into cartularis-bound volumes that preserved all the documents a monastery needed to defend its holdings in court. The work was tedious but critical. If a dispute arose, say, over a pasture or a mill, monks would search their archives, find the original charter, and present it before a royal or ecclesiastical court. In many cases, the monastery's documents decided who ruled and who paid rent. The scribe as a political actor. While scribes were expected to be impartial transcribers, they were not above political manipulation. Margins sometimes contained commentary or corrections, subtly altering the tone or legal strength of a document. Occasionally, entire documents were forged, not always with malicious intent, but often to preserve a sense of tradition or to restore what was believed to be a lost right. The monastery of Glastonbury in England was famous for such practices. It produced elaborate charters claiming rights that may never have existed. These were accepted at the time because the monk's reputation for learning and record-keeping was so strong. Such forgeries weren't uncommon. In a world where memory was institutional, not personal, what was written became what was true. Literacy and the monopoly of knowledge. In much of medieval Europe, literacy was limited almost entirely to the church. That gave monastic scribes an extraordinary advantage. They could read laws, write petitions, calculate taxes, and maintain genealogies. As a result, nobles and even kings were dependent on monks for their legal and historical legitimacy. Without written proof, a noble's land claim might be ignored. Without clerical support, a royal decree might not be remembered. Monasteries became places where memory and identity were shaped. Chronicles recorded who ruled when battles occurred and how God's will was manifest in history. The Chronicles, boring books that shaped nations. Monks also wrote annals and chronicles, year-by-year accounts of events. These weren't just historical records, they were tools of governance. By framing events in certain ways, praising some kings, condemning others, highlighting divine punishment or reward, scribes influenced how future rulers understood their roles. Take the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, compiled in part by monastic scribes. It shaped English identity by establishing a continuous narrative of kingship, conquest, and survival. Its dry, factual tone masked its power. It told a kingdom what to remember and what to forget. Even local chronicles kept in small abbess provided a legal memory. that kings and bishops depended on when asserting rights or investigating claims. Bureaucratic survival strategies. For monasteries, writing was survival. The more documentation they produced, the better protected they were. When new kings came to power, monasteries quickly produced charters confirming their privileges. When borders shifted or taxes rose, monks sent carefully written petitions, backed by ancient documents. Some even developed sophisticated diplomatic strategies, offering scribal services to lords in exchange for protection or land. A well-timed charter, a flattering chronicle entry, or a legally clever petition could gain a monastery more influence than an army ever could. A day in the life, Brother Cedric's quiet power. Let's imagine a day in the life of Brother Cedric, a fictional but typical monk scribe in a 12th century English abbey. Cedric rises before dawn, attends matins, then walks silently to the scriptorium. He's assigned to copy a royal charter confirming the monastery's right to collect tolls on a nearby bridge. The Latin is formal, the names unfamiliar, the ink slow to dry. At midday, he eats with the other monks' vegetables, bread, and a lebefour returning to his desk. Later, he annotates the monastery's cartulary, updating boundary descriptions after a recent survey. Before evening prayers, Cedric delivers a copy of the charter to the abbot, who will seal it tomorrow and send it to the local royal court. Cedric says nothing, but his pen has protected the monastery's income for another generation. The quiet revolution of the pen. While battles reshaped borders, monks redrew them with maps and charters. While kings made decrees, monks preserved them. While nobles died in war, monks remembered their lineage and inheritance rights. Over centuries, the monasteries created a quiet revolution. Through writing, they governed land, legitimized rule, preserved law, and subtly influenced how power flowed. Their influence did not come from grand speeches or battlefield heroics but from quiet repetition, from copying, cataloging, and preserving what others ignored. But what happens when new technologies disrupt this ancient scribal order? Can ink and parchment survive in a world of paper and press? The steady scratch of quills fills the scriptorium. Candlelight flickers against shelves lined with vellum scrolls, bound codices, and parchment charters. A young novice carefully copies a papal decretum that will be used to settle a boundary dispute. Outside, the land is quiet, but inside, political and legal power flows through ink. We now continue our journey into how these scriptoriathos, quiet places of thought and transcription, functioned as bureaucratic engines of the medieval world. Monastic literacy, a strategic monopoly. By the 11th and 12th centuries, the monopoly on literacy held by monasteries was not only religious, it was strategic. While some nobles had clerics in their courts, and cathedral schools began to train secular clergy, the monastery remained the central repository of literacy and documentation in much of Europe. Monasteries became key partners in governance because they could produce reliable charters, legal petitions, inventories of assets, transcriptions of royal laws, accurate genealogies. This information flow allowed secular rulers to exercise power more effectively through delegated memory. If the king forgot a charter or the bishop disputed a land grant, a monastery's records could restore order or shape it to its own favor. Cartularies, organized archives of authority. One of the most underappreciated but powerful tools in medieval governance was the Cartularia manuscript volume that compiled all the documents relevant to a monastery's property and rights. Rather than storing loose charters that could be lost or damaged, cartularies transcribed charters word for word, added commentary in margins, grouped documents by theme or geography, preserved historical context. These were not simply record-keeping devices, they were legal weapons. Monasteries brought them to court, referenced them in disputes, and used them to train new scribes. They enabled an institution's continuity across generations. When an abbot died, his successor turned to the cartulary to understand the abbey's claims and obligations. The Codex Diplomaticus Cavensis from southern Italy is one example. Spanning centuries, it provides not only charters but commentary and updates, functioning almost like a living administrative ledger. Forgery as a survival strategy. One of the more boring but revealing truths of medieval ecclesiastical history is that forgery was rampant and often rationalized. Monasteries sometimes produced forged documents to restore rights they believed were unfairly taken, to fill gaps in lost archives, to defend themselves from more powerful lords. A well-known example is the forgery of the Privilege of Pippin, where the Abbey of Saint Denis in France presented a document claiming it had received immunity from taxation, granted by King Pippin long after his death. Modern scholars have dissected these forgeries not simply to expose deception, but to understand what monasteries needed to claim in order to survive. The forgeries were reflections of a power structure that increasingly demanded written proof, even if the facts were centuries old. The scriptorium as political factory. Let's take a closer look at how a typical scriptorium functioned. Each monk had a role. Copyists reproduced texts letter for letter. Correctors checked the work for accuracy. Rubricators added headings and red-letter notations. Illustrators in wealthier monasteries adorned pages with illuminations, artistic flourishes that sometimes conveyed meaning or status. The production was slow. A single Bible could take a team of monks a year or more to copy. Yet the value wasn't in the speed, it was in the precision and authority of the finished document. A charter produced by the Abbey of Cluny or Monte Cassino carried weight not simply because of its contents, but because of the prestige and integrity associated with the monastery. Rulers knew this. They often sent petitions to monasteries requesting that documents be copied, authenticated, or even stored. In this way, monasteries functioned as medieval archives and registries, crucial to legal and territorial stability. Monastic historians as policy influencers. Monks who wrote chronicles were not just historians, they were interpreters of power. By selecting which events to record, what moral judgments to apply, and how to link events to divine will, these chroniclers shaped the worldview of rulers and subjects alike. For example, William of Malmesbury, an English monk, crafted a narrative of English history that emphasized the legitimacy of Norman rule after the conquest. The Chronicon of Saint-Denis framed Capetian kings as defenders of the church, reinforcing their moral authority. These weren't lies, nor were they neutral. They were carefully constructed truths meant to serve the monastery's interests, reinforce alliances, or promote a stable social order. And because these chronicles were copied and preserved, they often became primary sources for later historians and rulers. Thus, a monastery's internal viewpoint could shape national identity. When monasteries became landlords, the importance of writing also extended to manorial management. By the 13th century, many monasteries operated extensive estates, and they used writing to record tenant obligations, track grain yields, register labor requirements, document disputes and resolutions. The Polyptych of Erminin, compiled by monks at the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés near Paris, is an excellent example. It contains detailed records of lands, families, livestock, and obligations owed to the abbey, functioning almost like a census. These records weren't just bureaucratic tools. They shaped local economies. When tenants challenged obligations, the monastery could produce a polyptych or rental roll and enforce its claims. Here again, ink governed lives. The rise of the university and the decline of the cloister. By the late 12th and early 13th centuries, the rise of universities in Paris, Bologna, and Oxford began to challenge monastic dominance of literacy and legal knowledge. Cathedral schools evolved into centers of scholarly production, often staffed by secular clergy rather than monks. These scholars developed canon law, administrative techniques, and eventually scientific thought outside the cloister. This was not a sharp break but a slow evolution. Still, monasteries began to lose their monopoly. As professional scribes emerged, and as kings built royal chanceries staffed with clerics trained at universities, monasteries focused more on internal records and less on state bureaucracy. Yet even in this changing world, monastic scribes remained vital for preserving early documents, copying sacred texts, maintaining long-term archives. Their role became more historical than political but no less important. The paradox of permanence. What stands out about monastic governance is the paradox it represents. Monks rejected the world but preserved its rules. They vowed silence but spoke through charters and chronicles. They sought heaven but managed the earthly obligations of kings and lords. Their influence was never loud, but it was structural woven into how power functioned, how memory was stored, and how legitimacy was maintained. The ink may have dried centuries ago, but the lines they drew on maps, in deeds, in history still shaped the frameworks of law and governance that followed. But how could such a delicate system survive the coming shock? When a new invention, cheap, fast, and mechanical, would make every monk's pen obsolete, what would become of their power? It is a quiet evening in a 15th century monastery. A young monk gently blows on a page of parchment to dry the ink. He has spent the better part of 3 days copying a single charter. Yet, in the bustling city of Mainz, another man has just printed 180 copies of the Bible in the time it would take the monk to copy one. The monk does not know it yet, but his world is ending. Let us now explore the unraveling of monastic scribal dominance and the seismic impact of a new technology, the printing press, Gutenberg's machine, and the end of scribal supremacy. Around 1450, Johannes Gutenberg developed the movable type printing press, combining existing technologies such as the wine press, metal movable type, and oil-based inkinto, a single mechanism that would reshape history. The printing press could produce hundreds of identical pages in a fraction of the time, use cheaper materials, such as paper rather than vellum, reduce the number of errors introduced by human scribes, increase accessibility to written texts far beyond monastic libraries. The Gutenberg Bible, printed around 1455, was a masterpiece of beautiful, accurate, and fast, and it marked the beginning of the end for monastic scriptoria. Monastic reaction, curiosity, concern, and resentment. At first, many monasteries viewed printed books with curiosity. Some abbots even commissioned printed works, particularly for liturgical use. The quality of early print was high, and many presses imitated scribal design, leaving spaces for illuminations, even including rubricated headings. But tension soon followed. The printing press threatened centuries of scribal training, devalued hand-copied manuscripts, undermined monastic control of information, empowered urban scholars and lay readers. Scribes had once been the guardians of memory. Now, memory was mass-produced. In some cases, monasteries tried to resist. They continued copying by hand out of tradition or pride, but the economic logic was overwhelming. A printed book could cost 1/10 of a manuscript and contain fewer errors. Eventually, even the most conservative abbots conceded. Bureaucracy moves beyond the cloister. As the cost of books dropped, secular bureaucracies expanded. Royal chanceries, town councils, and legal courts began keeping their own records, maintaining their own archives, and producing their own documentation, often using professional lay scribes trained in Chancery hand or Roman script. The University of Bologna, which trained clerics in both canon and Roman law, became a center of document production and legal theory, mostly independent of monasteries. Kings and princes developed their own state archives, no longer reliant on monastic libraries to settle disputes or remember lineage. The rise of national bureaucracies in France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire diluted the monastery's unique administrative role. Where once the monk's pen shaped power, now clerks, judges, and notaries held the ink. Decline in monastic landholdings. Even before the printing press, many monasteries had begun to lose economic power. The Black Death had decimated monastic populations. Rising peasant expectations after the plague disrupted manorial labor, and changing patterns of trade and warfare made land wealth less reliable. In England, the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII, 1536–1541, was a catastrophic end to monastic political and economic influence. Over 800 monasteries were closed, their lands confiscated, their libraries destroyed or scattered. Manuscripts once lovingly copied were used to wrap fish or start fires. In France and parts of Germany, similar fates awaited monasteries during the Reformation. The printing press played a key role. Reformers like Martin Luther used pamphlets, translated Bibles, and mass communication to challenge the very authority that monasteries had helped preserve. From knowledge gatekeepers to antiquarians. By the 16th century, monasteries no longer controlled the flow of official information, but many found a new purpose as repositories of ancient knowledge. Some monasteries reinvented themselves as libraries, collecting not just sacred texts but classical works rediscovered during the Renaissance. Monks became editors, historians, and collectors, rather than creators of new records. The Abbey of St. Gall in Switzerland, for example, became renowned for its preservation of early medieval music manuscripts and scholarly works. Other monastic institutions opened their libraries to scholars, shifting from bureaucratic centers to academic sanctuaries. Yet the tone had changed. Where once a monastery's scriptoria had shaped the political map of Europe, now it was a quiet archivy, a place of memory rather than power. Legacy of the scribes. Despite their decline, the legacy of monastic scribes persisted. Canon law codified by scribes remained the basis for ecclesiastical governance for centuries. Cartularies were used by early modern legal scholars to reconstruct medieval property law. Chronicles and annals copied in scriptoria became foundational sources for historians. Diplomatic forms, the structure and phrasing of charters, influenced modern legal drafting. And beyond the practical, there was something existential. The idea that writing preserved order, that memory could be institutionalized, that power could be guided, not just enforced. Monastic scribes didn't just preserve the past, they helped define the concept of historical continuity, of governance through precedent, and law through lineage. A final portrait, Brother Matthias in the Last Codex. Imagine Brother Matthias, a monk in the late 15th century. He is among the last trained manuscript scribes at his abbey. He knows that no one will come after him to learn the art of copying illuminated texts by hand. Still, he continues copying a commentary on the Rule of St. Benedict, just as it had been done for centuries. He takes care with every letter. He prays before every chapter. When he finishes, he binds it in leather and stores it in the monastery's library. He is not creating a tool of governance. He is crafting a monumento, a time when the pen ruled kingdoms. In a world reshaped by printing, bureaucracy, and centralized states, is there still room for memory carved in silence? Or do we forget the power that once lived in parchment and patience? Story 3. The Papal Court, Bureaucracy in the Holy See. You are standing in the courtyard of the Lateran Palace in 13th century Rome. The air is heavy with incense and the distant echo of Latin prayers. Behind you, pilgrims and emissaries wait restlessly. Ahead, through a series of guarded halls, the papal chancery is busy copying letters, granting privileges, and preparing bulls. This is not merely the heart of a faith, it is the headquarters of one of the most intricate and enduring bureaucracies in medieval history. Now begins our exploration of the papal court and how the Church, through meticulous bureaucracy, governed not just souls but kings, kingdoms, and ideas. The centralization of papal power. Following the decline of Roman imperial authority in the West, the Bishop of Rome, Pope, gradually ascended to a position of both spiritual preeminence and temporal influence. By the High Middle Ages, especially from the 11th to the 13th centuries, the papal court had evolved into a fully functioning government, with departments, clerks, diplomats, and legal experts. This was not merely a religious court, it was an international hub of governance, overseeing the Church's affairs across Christendom. From England to Hungary, from Sicily to Sweden, appeals, disputes, and requests filtered back to Rome, where the Curia Romana, Roman Curia, processed, judged, or directed them. At the apex of this web sat the Pope, but beneath him was a vast clerical machine. The Curia Romana, church government in action. The Curia included a range of offices and departments. The Chancery, responsible for drafting, sealing, and dispatching papal documents. The Camera Apostolica, papal treasury, managed church finances, including taxes, tithes, and revenues from vacant bishoprics. The Rota Romana, a court of appeals where cases from across Europe could be tried. The College of Cardinals, the Pope's advisory body and eventual electorate. The Datary and Apostolic Penitentiary handled dispensations, indulgences, and personal petitions. Each department had its own staff, hierarchy, and specialization. The Curia was a model of medieval administration, dense, formalized, and slow-moving, but staggeringly comprehensive. Documents passed through multiple layers of clerks and scribes. Language mattered, formulas mattered, protocols mattered. Even the color of ink used in certain sections of a document had significance. This was the machinery behind the voice of the Pope. Papal letters, instruments of power. The chief tools of papal governance were official letters, particularly bulls, formal letters with lead seals, often used for decrees or appointments. Briefs, shorter, more personal letters used for less formal communication. Mandates, indulgences, rescripts, specialized forms for specific instructions or privileges. The process was painstaking. Petitioners submitted supplications, requests, often through a procurator in Rome. These were examined, annotated, sometimes debated. Approved requests became papal letters, copied by hand, sealed, and dispatched. A single papal bull could appoint a bishop, excommunicate a noble, authorize a university, grant indulgences to raise funds for crusades, redefine a kingdom's boundaries or ecclesiastical structure. Once issued, a bull had the weight of law and was copied, recopied, and entered into registers for posterity. Papal registers, medieval filing systems. The papacy kept records with a diligence that rivaled and often exceeded that of royal courts. From the 1190s onward, the papal registers, Registra Vaticana, recorded nearly every outgoing letter. These volumes are still preserved in the Vatican archives, are among the most detailed medieval records we possess. They contained names of petitioners and their envoys, locations and dates, copies of letters sent, legal reasoning or precedents. This registration system allowed popes to track disputes, respond to follow-ups, and demonstrate continuity with previous papal rulings. It also gave future popes a bureaucratic memoriam that could be invoked in diplomacy, policy, or canon law. The role of cardinals, bureaucrats and power brokers. In theory, cardinals advised the Pope on spiritual matters. In practice, they were senior administrators, diplomats, and often factional leaders. Each cardinal typically held a titular church in Rome but also ran offices within the Curia. Some oversaw diplomatic missions. Others led judicial hearings. Some controlled finances. Many were deeply involved in elections, reform councils, and negotiations with monarchs. The College of Cardinals operated like a senate, reviewing high-level matters. But they also formed internal factions, often divided along national, ideological, or personal lines. French versus Italian, reformer versus conservative, pro-empire versus pro-Français divisions shaped appointments and policies for generations. The result, a court as political as any royal palace. Diplomacy in red robes. The papal court was constantly receiving and dispatching envoys. Kings sent ambassadors or petitioners to gain papal approval for marriages, coronations, or crusades. Bishops sent appeals for support against local lord or rival clerics. Monasteries lobbied for privileges or exemptions. Cities requested interdicts or support for cathedral foundations. Each envoy had to navigate the labyrinth of the Curia, getting audiences, paying fees, understanding protocols. Knowing Latin was essential. Knowing the right cardinal was better. Sometimes the Curia functioned like a law firm, reviewing documentation and issuing rulings. Other times, it resembled a marketplace, where fees and favors moved decisions along. Yet despite this complexity, the Curia maintained a veneer of spiritual impartiality, grounded in canon law and centuries of precedent. The fee system, bureaucracy for sale. By the 13th century, many papal services came with fees. A new bishop paid for his confirmation. A monastery paid to have its privileges reaffirmed. A petitioner paid to expedite his case. These fees funded the Curia and financed papal operations, but they also drew criticism. Reformers saw them as spiritual corruption. Monarchs viewed them as interference in national sovereignty. Some kings, like Philip IV of France, tried to restrict papal revenues in their realms. Others, like Edward I of England, taxed the church to reclaim lost income. Still, the papal court persisted complex, rich, and functionally global. Papal courts and justice. The papal court was also a court of law. Clerics from across Europe could appeal to Rome if they believed a local bishop or archbishop had judged them unfairly. While this offered a valuable check on local power, it also created long delays and high costs. To hear these cases, the Pope employed auditors, judges trained in canon and Roman law. These officials reviewed petitions, questioned witnesses, and wrote opinions that helped shape ecclesiastical jurisprudence. Papal courts became famous for their meticulous procedures and infamous for their slow pace. A slow-moving empire. The papal court was not fast. Letters could take weeks or months to reach distant parts of Europe. Appeals might drag on for years. Rulings could be overturned by successor popes. Policies shifted with changing alliances. Yet this slowness was part of its power. The papal court endured because it was deliberate, structured, and grounded in precedent. Its bureaucracy gave it an aura of permanence. And through it all, the papacy managed to maintain not just a religious role but a governmental one, rivaling kings and emperors. But what happens when monarchs grow stronger, when cities grow bolder, and when the Pope's own court becomes too large to govern itself? Can bureaucracy preserve power indefinitely, or does it eventually smother it? In a candle-lit chamber of the Lateran Palace, a papal clerk carefully folds a letter bearing the leaden seal of the Pope. Outside, a group of French envoys await an audience. A bishop from Hungary has arrived to contest an excommunication. An English abbot has been here for months, mired in the endless petitions of the Roman Curia. The gears of Christendom turned slowly but steadily within these marble halls. We follow the peak of the papal court's administrative might and the first serious efforts to reform, resist, or redirect its ever-expanding influence. A bureaucracy under strain. By the late 13th and early 14th centuries, the Roman Curia had grown into a complex, sprawling system. Its success brought with it a new problem: overreach. The Curia's functions now included approving every major ecclesiastical appointment across Europe, reviewing a growing number of legal appeals, managing an increasingly intricate tax system, overseeing the financing of crusades, issuing indulgences, dispensations, and privileges at an industrial scale. This workload required more clerks, more lawyers, more space, and more money. Fees became formalized. Simonize buying and selling of offices or favors was not always legal, but increasingly tolerated. While the papacy retained its moral voice, it now operated more like a centralized medieval government and less like a purely spiritual institution. The Church had, in effect, built a state without borders, but not without problems. Avignon, the papacy leaves Rome. In 1309, under Pope Clement V, the papacy moved its seat from Rome to the city of Avignon in southern France. Though technically under papal authority, Avignon was geographically and politically close to the French crown. The decision was born from Rome's instability and the influence of King Philip IV of France. What followed was a period known as the Avignon Papacy, 1309–1377, during which 7 popes resided in Avignon. There, the papal court grew even more centralized and bureaucratic, with many positions filled by French cardinals and clerics. Key developments during this era included the expansion of papal tax collection, particularly through the annates, first year's revenue from new ecclesiastical appointments, increased control over bishoprics and abbacies, a more systematic approach to issuing indulgences, a detailed record-keeping system that dwarfed most contemporary royal courts. Critics referred to this period as the Babylonian captivity of the Church, implying spiritual exile and moral decline. Many accused the papacy of becoming a French puppet and prioritizing financial gain over spiritual guidance. The rise of national churches. As the papal court became more centralized and remote, secular rulers began to assert their own ecclesiastical independence. In England, kings resisted papal taxation. Parliament passed the Statute of Provisors, 1351, limiting the Pope's ability to appoint clergy. The Statute of Praemunire, 1353, made it a crime to appeal to a foreign authority, i.e., Rome, in legal matters. In France, the monarchy negotiated for more control over episcopal appointments. The idea of Gallicanism emerged, belief that the French Church should be governed independently of Rome in temporal matters. These tensions marked the beginning of a long decline in papal political supremacy, not because of rebellion, but because of administrative exhaustion. The more the papacy tried to manage, the more power slipped to local hands. The Great Western Schism. In 1377, Pope Gregory XI returned the papacy to Rome. But upon his death in 1378, the College of Cardinals, under pressure from a Roman mob, elected Urban VI, an Italian. Unhappy with the choice, many cardinals fled to Avignon and elected a rival pope, Clement VII. This resulted in the Great Western Schism, 1378–1417, during which 2, and later 3, men claimed to be pope. Each papal court had its own curia, its own cardinals, its own chancery, and its own tax collectors. This bureaucratic confusion sowed political chaos across Europe, as nations had to choose which pope to support. Spiritual doubt, as the legitimacy of the papacy seemed uncertain. administrative duplication, with rival documents, bulls, and appointments issued in competition. The schism revealed a fundamental flaw. The papal court had become too centralized to function without a single recognized leader, yet too institutionalized to stop operating altogether. The Council of Constance, reigning in the papacy. In response to the schism, the Council of Constance, 1414–1418, was convened. It aimed to end the schism by deposing or accepting the resignation of all rival popes, elect a new unified pope, Martin V. Address church reform. The council succeeded in ending the schism but struggled with reform. One of its key proposals, conciliarism, held that general councils had more authority than the pope, especially in matters of reform. While this idea gained traction for a time, the popes who followed gradually reasserted control, aided once again by bureaucracy. Councils required agreement. The pope could act unilaterally. Popes controlled appointments, and thus could influence future councils. The Curia remained intact, its memory unbroken by the chaos of recent decades. Yet the damage was done. Faith in papal infallibility and in the infallibility of its administrative machine was eroding. The printing press and the spread of dissent. The invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century had profound consequences for the papal court. Previously, papal documents, bulls, decrees, letters had limited circulation. Most people only knew of them through local clergy or cathedral pronouncements. With print, however, papal errors and scandal could be publicized and criticized. Reformist ideas could spread beyond the control of the Curia. Pamphlets and broadsheets bypassed official channels. Early reformers like Jan Hus, who was burned at the Council of Constance, and later Martin Luther, used the printing press to challenge the authority of the papal court. Luther's 95 Theses in 1517 directly attacked the sale of indulgences, a system refined and managed by the papal bureaucracy. The bureaucracy that had once united Christendom was now a target seen not as a guardian of the faith, but as its betrayer. Papal efforts to reassert control. Despite the mounting crises, the papacy did not collapse. In the late 15th century, popes like Sixtus IV, Innocent VIII, and Alexander VI attempted to strengthen control by expanding the papal court with new administrative offices, increasing use of papal nuncios, permanent ambassadors, launching building programs in Rome to reaffirm authority, using nepotism to secure alliances within the Curia. Yet these efforts were often seen as political rather than spiritual. The papacy became associated with corruption, extravagance, and ambition. As more monarchs sought national religious independence, the Curia struggled to maintain the universal authority it had once wielded. Can a system built on the promise of unity survive in an age that demands local control and faster change? Or must every institution, however grand, eventually drown in its own paperwork? It is 1520. A papal brief carefully copied and sealed in the chancery of the Vatican condemns a German monk named Martin Luther, but the document is not met with the expected submission. Instead, it is burned publicly in Wittenberg. The authority of the papal court, once uncontested, now faces a challenge that neither canon law nor bulls can contain. The machine has begun to crack. We follow the collapse of universal papal authority, the decline of its vast bureaucracy, and the ways in which the Curia sought to survive in a fragmented Christian world. The Reformation strikes at the papal core. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in 1517, he ignited more than a theological dispute, struck directly at the bureaucratic and financial structure of the church. The sale of indulgences, very practice managed by papal officials to fund projects like St. Peter's Basilica, became the symbol of corruption. Luther's challenge exposed the fee-based nature of many papal services, the intrusiveness of papal tax collection, the perception of the Pope as more prince than pastor. Within months, printed versions of Luther's critique spread across Europe, bypassing papal controls entirely. The papal court, with its clerks, scribes, and diplomats, could not respond quickly enough. The bureaucratic engine that once gave the Church coherence was now seen as the enemy of reform. The loss of Northern Europe. The Reformation did not just fracture theology, it fractured administration. As states like Sweden, Denmark, and parts of Germany broke from Rome, they ceased paying taxes to the papacy, stopped referring cases to the Roman courts, and nationalized church appointments and revenues. England under Henry VIII presented a unique case. In 1534, through the Act of Supremacy, the king declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. The split was not initially theological, it was bureaucratic. Henry rejected Rome's authority to annul his marriage. He confiscated monastic properties. He severed the legal and administrative ties between the English clergy and the papal curia. For Rome, this was a diplomatic and administrative disaster. Files, registries, revenues, and influence gone, with no military means to restore them. The Counter-Reformation and the Council of Trent. In response, the Church initiated the Counter-Reformation, beginning in earnest with the Council of Trent, 1545–1563. Though the council met far from Rome, its outcomes were processed and implemented through the curia. Seminaries were established to improve clerical education. Doctrinal clarity was reinforced through catechisms and approved texts. The Index of Forbidden Books was compiled and enforced through papal bureaucracy. The Roman Inquisition was expanded to guard orthodoxy, using legal procedures rooted in centuries of canon law. The papal court now functioned as a fortress bureaucracy, defensive, controlling, and increasingly focused on doctrine and discipline rather than diplomacy. Bureaucratic refinement under the Jesuits and beyond. The Jesuit order, approved in 1540, became an extension of papal authority, but unlike the curia, it was mobile, adaptive, and internationally embedded. Jesuits reported directly to the Pope, bypassing traditional ecclesiastical hierarchies. They brought the papal voice to distant lands, China, Japan, Brazil, just as European monarchs shut their doors to Roman jurisdiction. In many ways, they were the new diplomats of the Holy See, while the curia remained the core administration. To support this network, the curia streamlined. Propaganda-fied Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith was created in 1622 to manage global missions. Sacra Congregatio de Indis, Sacra Rota Romana, and other offices were professionalized. Secretaries and prefects became career churchmen, trained in canon law, operating with greater legal precision than ever before. Still, the scale of authority had shrunk. The papal bureaucracy no longer governed all of Christendom, but only the Roman Catholic portion, and even within it, local bishops and monarchs often resisted papal interference. The Enlightenment and growing irrelevance. As Europe entered the Age of Reason, the papal court began to appear increasingly anachronistic. In an age of science, secular law, and state bureaucracies, the curia's reliance on Latin forms, archaic legal structures, obscure protocols, began to seem disconnected from contemporary governance. Even Catholic monarchies like Austria and Spain limited Rome's influence. Joseph II of Austria reorganized the church within his empire, ignoring papal objections. In France, Gallicanism remained strong, with kings appointing bishops and limiting papal taxation. The papal court now governed more by consent than command, relying on diplomacy rather than authority. Napoleon and the humiliation of Rome. In the early 19th century, Napoleon Bonaparte dealt the papacy a symbolic blow. He invaded the Papal States, arresting Pope Pius VI, who died in exile. He later crowned himself emperor in 1804, with the Pope present but not placing the crown on Napoleon's head. It was a statement. Rome no longer made emperors. The papal court was temporarily dismantled. Though it was later restored, it was clear the political papacy was dying. The Papal States survived for a time, but the power of the Curia was now mostly spiritual and ceremonial. Vatican I and the recentralization of spiritual authority. In 1870, the First Vatican Council declared the doctrine of papal infallibility in matters of faith and morals when speaking ex cathedra. This was a response to centuries of fragmentation and attempt to reassert spiritual centrality in a decentralized world. Ironically, that same year, the Papal States were conquered by the forces of Italian unification. The Pope lost all temporal territory and retreated into the Vatican. The Curia remained but now as the administrative body of a stateless spiritual empire. It no longer issued commands to kings. It no longer decided land disputes across Europe, but it still kept the records, the seals, the rituals. The legacy of the papal bureaucracy. The modern Roman curias, reformed in the 20th and 21st centuries, retains much of the administrative DNA developed in the medieval period. A strong emphasis on canonical process, centralized handling of appointments, dispensations, and theological rulings, formalized protocols and layers of internal review. Though slimmed down and increasingly open to reform, it still operates in ways shaped by centuries of precedent. And so the question becomes not what the Curia has lost, but what it still guards: a memory, a structure, and a rhythm that governed half a continent for nearly 1,000 years. What happens when an empire of paper outlives its power? Is memory enough to preserve authority, or must even the most sacred bureaucracy learn to forget? Story 4: Tithes and Taxes, the Church's Economic Power. The village bell tolls. The people gather not for worship but for accounting. A clerk from the local monastery stands beside the reeve, scroll in hand, measuring grain, livestock, and produce. This is no tax from the king or the local lord. It is a tithe tenth owed not to a man but to God, or more precisely to God's stewards, the church. We begin a deep look into the economic might of the medieval church, built not on conquest, but on obligation, tradition, and record-keeping. The foundations of ecclesiastical wealth. By the 12th century, the church was the largest landholder in Europe. It held estates granted by kings, nobles, and pious donors. But the church's true strength did not lie merely in ownership, it lay in its system of regular income, most notably through the tithe. A tithe, from Old English tiagotha, meaning tenth, was the obligation of every Christian household to give 1/10 of their annual agricultural production to the church. It was an institutionalized expectation, enforced not by physical coercion, but by custom, law, and religious guilt. The tithe system provided a predictable stream of resources, from grain and wool to wine, honey, and cattle. And because it touched nearly every household, it gave the church an economic footprint in every village, town, and manor. Types of tithes, a bureaucrat's dream. Tithes came in several varieties, each carefully categorized by the church's growing legal apparatus. Predial tithes, taken from the land grain, vegetables, fruit. Mixed tithes, from animal smoke, wool, lambs, eggs. Personal tithes, based on income from labor or trade, such as fishing or craftsmanship. The exact form of tithe varied by region, season, and interpretation. In many cases, custom dictated which type applied, and disputes often arose over what should count. To manage this, church officials maintained records, boundaries, ledgers, and receipts. In wealthier parishes, Tithes were stored in specially built barns, some of which still stand today as massive testaments to medieval religious revenue. Who collected the tithe? Contrary to modern assumptions, tithes were not always collected directly by the local priest. In many cases, the income was appropriated by monasteries, who held the advowson, the right to collect income from a parish, farmed out to laymen, who paid a fee for the right to collect and keep tithe, sometimes aggressively split, with a portion going to the local clergy and another to the bishop, cathedral chapter, or Rome itself. This created a complex chain of entitlements, often leading to confusion and resentment. A poor priest might serve a rural flock, while a distant monastery or bishop collected the majority of the revenue. Such arrangements led to numerous legal disputes, with canon lawyers citing decades-old documents, custom, and papal bulls to defend or challenge tithe claims. Beyond tithes, the church's revenue arsenal. The church's economy was far more than just tithes. Additional sources of wealth included fees for sacraments. Baptisms, marriages, funerals, and burials often required a donation or formal fee. Donations and bequests. Wealthy individuals frequently gave money or land to the church in hopes of securing salvation or a prestigious burial place. Rents and labor obligations. Monastic landlords collected rent from tenant farmers and could demand days of labor, called boon work. Papal taxes and levies. Rome collected income from across Europe, especially during crusade calls or papal election expenses. Vacant bishoprics. When a bishop died, the church, or crown, often claimed the revenues of the office during the vacancy. In some regions, the church's economic operations rivaled those of the crown. It employed stewards, accountants, auditors, and legal experts. Some bishoprics and abbeys managed hundreds of manors, complete with fish ponds, mills, and forests. The tithe and the peasant. To the average peasant, the tithe was just another obligation like the corvée or the lord's rent. But unlike secular taxes, the tithe was framed as a moral duty. Failing to pay could result in excommunication, denial of burial in consecrated ground, spiritual condemnation. For many, this spiritual threat was more terrifying than legal punishment. But for some, particularly in hard years, paying the tithe meant starvation. Debates arose. Should a tithe be paid on gleanings? Should it include produce lost to bad weather? Could it be paid in labor or goods instead of crops? These questions were not academic. They were settled in church courts, sometimes with surprising strictness. Tithe disputes in the church courts. The church maintained its own judicial system to resolve tithe conflicts. These ecclesiastical courts operated with trained clerics and scribes, enforcing canon law. Disputes might arise between a landowner and a monastery over rights to collect local tithes, villagers and a parish priest over whether income from woodcutting counted, merchants and bishops over tithes on trade profits. Court cases were recorded, preserved, and sometimes appealed to higher authorities, including Rome. The records from these courts are one of the richest sources of information we have today about rural economics and the enforcement of religious obligation. Case study: the monastery of Bury St. Edmunds. In 13th century England, the Abbey of Bury St. Edmunds was one of the wealthiest in Europe. It held vast lands, numerous churches, and tithe rights over dozens of parishes. It employed a professional staff of bailiffs, stewards, and legal advisors to enforce its rights. It collected tithes in kind-grain fish, timber, and stored them in enormous barns. But its power came at a price. The abbey was deeply resented by local townspeople, who rebelled in 1327 and briefly seized its properties. Their demands included the right to appoint their own clergy and freedom from tithe collection by distant landlords. The rebellion was suppressed, but It underscored a growing tension between wealthy ecclesiastical institutions and local communities. The church in coin, monetizing faith. Over time, the church shifted from accepting payments in kind to preferring coinage, especially in urban areas. This led to the rise of money-based fees for services, greater use of clerical accountants and double-entry bookkeeping, a stronger connection between spiritual life and financial obligation. This monetization sometimes drew harsh criticism. Preachers in the late medieval period increasingly denounced greedy priests and bishops, accusing them of turning the church into a merchant house of salvation. Is faith corrupted when measured in coin? Or was the church merely doing what every government must, raising revenue to maintain order, support infrastructure, and fund its mission? It is a feast day in a bustling medieval town. While pilgrims line up for blessings at the cathedral doors, just beyond the nave, in a dark wood-paneled room, a group of clerks with ink-stained fingers tally accounts. They are not monks in contemplation but accountants in cassocks. Their job, to ensure every penny owed to the church is accounted for. Now we turn from the peasant's obligation to the church's administrative mastery of wealth, from the countryside's tithes to the halls of episcopal treasuries and monastic landholdings. A church of land and ledger. By the 13th century, the church controlled between 1/4 to 1/3 of all arable land in Western Europe. This was not idle property, it was structured and exploited through systems of taxation, rents, and labor obligations. Every diocese and monastery operated like an economic institution, with the bishop or abbot as CEO, and a cadre of clerics, bailiffs, and stewards serving as managers and accountants. These institutions oversaw tenant contracts, feudal dues, rent rolls, mill fees, pasture rights. Manorial records were meticulously maintained. From the Winchester pipe rolls to the politics of France, these documents reveal an institution obsessed with economic clarity, at least on paper. The management of monastic estates. Monasteries like Cluny, Monte Cassino, and Westminster Abbey were not merely centers of prayer, they were also rural corporations, sometimes managing hundreds of dependent properties. Each manor had a reeve or bailiff responsible for overseeing daily work, tenant farmers who owed rent or labor, sometimes both. Domain land worked directly for the monastery's benefit. Workshops, mills, and fish ponds, generating specialized goods and services. At Cluny, for instance, annual accounts were sent to the mother house from dozens of subordinate priories. These were reviewed, tabulated, and sometimes audite, using formulas and comparison tools that were remarkably advanced for the time. In a world where kings ruled through charisma and force, the monastery ruled through balance sheets and boundaries. Canon law and property rights. Canon law, the legal framework of the church, recognized and protected ecclesiastical property with zeal. Once a field, mill, or forest was granted to the church, be king, noble, or peasantate, became inalienable. That is, it could not be sold, transferred, or reclaimed without ecclesiastical permission. This rule ensured the permanence of ecclesiastical wealth, the protection of donations from heirs or secular authorities, a growing network of mortmain holdingslands held in the dead hand of the church, immune from inheritance laws. This legal status often frustrated monarchs who viewed the church's lands as untaxable and unavailable, but it gave the church an edge, stability in a chaotic world. The taxation of clergy by secular monarchs. Despite its wealth, the church frequently clashed with kings over money. Secular rulers wanted a share of the church, revenues especially during war, but church leaders claimed spiritual immunity from royal taxation. This tension led to Edward I and Edward III of England imposing taxes on clergy. The French monarchy's 13th century struggle with Pope Boniface VIII over clerical taxation. The famous papal bull Clericis Lacos, 1296, forbidding clergy from paying taxes to secular authorities without papal consent. This led to a political showdown between Boniface VIII and King Philip IV of France, resulting in excommunication threats, legal battles, and eventually the humiliation of the papacy, with Boniface briefly imprisoned by royal agents. Money, not theology, was the root of this conflict. Papal revenue streams, a global collection network. While local churches collected tithes and rents, Rome had its own system of financial collection, including Peter's Pence, an annual contribution from English Christians, originally voluntary but later enforced. Annats, the first year's income from a newly appointed bishop or abbot, often sent directly to Rome. Servitia Communia, a fee paid by bishops to the papal treasury upon confirmation of their office. Papal legates, clerics sent to collect extraordinary taxes or campaign funds, especially during crusades or papal elections. Papal financial agents operated across Europe, functioning much like tax collectors for an empire without borders. Their arrival in towns and courts often caused tension, especially when they demanded payment in cash rather than in kind. The Church's role in lending and credit. While usurious charging of interest was officially prohibited by canon law, the Church was not immune from the economic necessity of lending. Monasteries often lent grain from tithe barns during times of famine, expecting repayment with surplus. Advanced funds to tenant farmers, deducting from future rents. Borrowed money themselves to finance cathedral building, pilgrimage hospitality, or political lobbying. To bypass usury laws, creative techniques were used. Late fees disguised as penalties rather than interest. Partnership arrangements, where investors received a share of profits instead of fixed returns. The use of Jewish moneylenders as intermediaries, particularly in England and France, allowing Christian institutions to borrow indirectly. The result was a sophisticated credit system that allowed spiritual institutions to function like proto-banks, even as they denounced lending at interest from the pulpit. Financial record-keeping and early accountancy. Church institutions were among the first to develop systematic accounting practices. Monastic and cathedral treasuries maintained rent rolls, tithe ledgers, expenditure books, donation records, legal account books tied to manorial courts. The Doomsday Book, 1086, commissioned by William the Conqueror, drew heavily on church data to catalog English lands and taxes. It reflects the extent to which churchmen functioned as expert administrators. By the 14th century, some institutions began experimenting with double entry bookkeeping, especially in Italian city-states where church and commerce were closely linked. Resentment, resistance, and the seeds of reform. The church's wealth and financial demands inevitably provoked popular resentment. Wycliffe and the Lollards criticized the clergy's luxury and the burden of tithes. Peasant revolts in England and France sometimes included attacks on monastic property or tithe barns. Reformers like Jan Hus called for an end to clerical privileges and economic exploitation. These criticisms were often less about doctrine and more about money. The Church's economic reach, once its greatest strength, became its most visible vulnerability. By the time of the Reformation, grievances about tithes, church taxes, and the flow of money to Rome formed a major pillar of popular support for breaking away from papal authority. Can an institution that claims to be above the world ever avoid becoming entangled in its economy? Or was the Church's wealth a necessary evolone that enabled its spiritual mission, but also undermined it from within? A storm brews over a 16th-century English village. The local priest, once lord of tithe and harvest, has vanished. The tithe barn is locked, the land remeasured, and the manor church rededicated under royal authority. What was once the church's economic domain is now being dismantled, deed by deed, ledger by ledger. But not everywhere. Elsewhere, in cathedral cities and Roman halls, the church's economic system adapts, even endures. We follow the slow dismantling of the church's economic empire and examine how some aspects of its wealth management persisted well beyond the Middle Ages. The Reformation's economic earthquake. The Protestant Reformation was, in many ways, a financial revolution as much as a spiritual one. While reformers like Luther and Calvin criticized indulgences and spiritual abuses, the economic grievances of ordinary people gave the movement its momentum. Key flashpoints included opposition to tithes, especially in areas where they were seen as unfairly collected or diverted to distant institutions. Anti-clerical sentiment, particularly in towns where church taxes hindered local growth. Desire to reclaim land and property held by monasteries and bishops. In England, Henry VII's dissolution of the monasteries, 1536-1541, was the most dramatic response. It seized over 800 religious houses, transferred up to one-third of the kingdom's land from church to crown, and favored nobles. Destroyed centuries of financial records, monastic account books, and tithe rolls. Ended monastic obligations such as alms, hospitality, and free labor for the poor. It was, in effect, the nationalization of the church's economy. The fate of tithes in Protestant territories. Tithes did not disappear in Protestant lands, but their nature changed. In Lutheran regions, the state often assumed control over tithe revenues, redirecting them to fund state churches, poor relief, and schools. In Calvinist territories, tithes were sometimes abolished altogether or transformed into voluntary church support, reflecting a more congregational model. Yet in England, tithes remained mandatory until the 19th century, even after the Reformation. They were simply redirected from Rome to the Anglican Church, and eventually to lay tithe owners, who inherited church lands and retained the right to collect. This led to ongoing resentment among non-Anglican Christians, particularly Catholics and dissenters, who were forced to support a church they did not attend. The issue would spark riots, petitions, and legal reforms for generations. The Counter-Reformation and Roman retrenchment. In Catholic territories, the Church responded to the Reformation with tightened controls over its own finances. Religious orders like the Jesuits emphasized austerity, centralization, and professional education. Dioceses were restructured to ensure better tithe management and local accountability. Cathedral chapters were increasingly populated by educated clergy trained in law and administration, not just noble families. At the Council of Trent, 1545-1563, the Church reaffirmed the legitimacy of tithes and called for their proper and fair collection, in part to regain lost trust. In Spain and Italy, large ecclesiastical estates persisted, but increasingly aligned themselves with royal administration. Kings sought to manage or tax church property more directly, but always negotiated with papal representatives. Thus, even amid reform, the Church's financial system adapted less autonomous, but still influential. The Enlightenment and the rise of the secular state. As Europe moved into the 17th and 18th centuries, the Church's economic power faced a new kind of challenge, not from heretics, but from philosophers and bureaucrats. The Enlightenment brought new ideas about property rights, equality under law, separation of church and state, public finance and tax reform. In France, these ideas culminated in the French Revolution, which nationalized all church property, 1789. abolished the tithe and clerical privileges, confiscated millions of acres of ecclesiastical land, turned churches into public assets and clergy into salaried civil servants. Similar reforms occurred in Austria, Portugal, and eventually Latin America, as secular governments viewed church wealth as incompatible with modern governance. The quiet survivals. Yet even as revolutions dismantled formal structures, some church financial habits survived. The Catholic Church remained a major landholder in countries like Italy, Spain, and Ireland, well into the modern era. The management of ecclesiastical assets, though professionalized, retained features recognizable from medieval monastic accounts, regular audits, annual rents, investment in income-producing property. In some countries, state churches, e.g., Sweden, Denmark, England, continued to collect tithes or church taxes into the 20th century. In Germany, a unique solution emerged. The Kirchensteuer, a formal tax collected by the state on behalf of the churches, still in use today. The Vatican's modern finances. The most curious continuity is the Vatican itself. Though stripped of territory in the 19th century, it retained art and property assets, an internal accounting structure, modernized in the 20th century. The Vatican Bank, established in 1942. Income from donations, investments, and real estate. Scandals and reforms have emerged in recent decades, but the Vatican's economic footprint, while much smaller, still echoes the structures first laid down in medieval Rome, formal, hierarchical, and rooted in moral authority. Tithes in the modern imagination. Though tithes are no longer legally enforced in most places, they endure as a cultural memory. In literature, they appear as symbols of clerical greed or spiritual discipline. In modern evangelical churches, voluntary tithing remains common, framed not as tax, but as devotion. In discussions of historical inequality, church land ownership is often cited as a root of social stratification. Even the architecture remains. Tithe barns, abbey granges, and clerical manor houses still dot the European countryside, silent reminders of when the church's power was measured not only in souls but in sheep, wheat, and coin. Was the church's wealth its strength or its downfall? In the quiet collection of grain and rents, did it build a legacy of charity and order or one of resentment and revolt? Story 5. Trial by ordeal, justice under God's watch. A crowd gathers outside the churchyard. A pit has been dug, a cauldron of water brought to a boil. The accused pale and silent stands before the priest. This is not a trial of evidence or witnesses. It is a trial by ordeal. And in this moment, justice belongs not to man but to God. In this story, we explore how the medieval church administered and interpreted justice through ordeals, painful, mystical, and symbolic acts used to determine innocence in a world where truth was believed to lie not in evidence, but in divine intervention. The problem of proof in the early Middle Ages. In the post-Roman, pre-modern world, institutions of law enforcement and investigation were weak or non-existent. Courts lacked police forces, forensic methods, and often even formal codes of law. In this vacuum, truth was determined by public ritual, and no ritual was more feared or revered than the ordeal. While various types of ordeal existed across cultures, Christianized Europe, especially between the 8th and 13th centuries, gave the ordeal a sacred framing, integrating it into church procedure and sacramental rites. The basic belief: God would protect the innocent. If you underwent an ordeal and survived unscathed, you were presumed innocent. If you suffered, the guilt was yours to bear both legally and morally. Types of ordeals. The ordeal came in several painful and dramatic forms. Fire ordeal by fire. The accused was made to carry a red-hot iron bar for a set distance, usually 3 to 9 feet. Alternatively, they might place a hand into flame or walk barefoot over hot plowshares. The wound was bandaged and inspected 3 days later. If it healed cleanly, innocent. If it festered, guilty. Fire represented purity and divine light, and thus was thought to reveal hidden sin. Droplet ordeal by water. There were 2 kinds. Boiling water. The accused plunged a hand into boiling water to retrieve a ring or stone. Cold water. The accused was bound and thrown into a consecrated body of water. If they floated, the water rejected them guilty. If they sank, the water accepted them innocent, but now at risk of drowning. Water, as the element of baptism and purification, was believed to cooperate with divine will. Crossed ordeal by combat. More common among nobles, this ordeal assumed God would grant victory to the righteous. Accuser and accused or their champions fought, sometimes to the death. The victor was considered the one whose cause was just. Though brutal, this form appealed to the warrior ethos of the nobility. The church's role in ordeals. While ordeals were often administered by secular lords, the church provided legitimacy. Priests consecrated the objects, iron, water, ground. Liturgical prayers were said before and after. Ordeals were usually held on holy ground, and sometimes after Mass. Clerics sometimes acted as judges or observers, noting the results for legal records. This collaboration made the ordeal not just a test of physical endurance, but a sacramental moment in intersection between law and liturgy. Who underwent ordeals? Ordeals were common across all classes, but particularly for those who had no witnesses to support their innocence, were accused of serious crimes like theft, murder, or adultery, were notorious or disliked, and thus vulnerable to accusations, were outsiders, travelers, foreigners, or unlanded laborers. Sometimes, people requested ordeals voluntarily, seeking to prove their innocence when gossip or suspicion clouded their name. It was risky, but for many, it was better than lifetime shame. A case from the Carolingian age. In 9th century France, a woman named Gisela was accused of adultery by her husband. With no witnesses and unwilling to confess, she was subjected to the hot iron ordeal. A bishop oversaw the trial, with the iron consecrated and the procedure done before the altar. Gisela carried the iron bar 3 paces. Her hand was bound and examined 3 days later, no infection. She was declared innocent. This record, preserved in the bishop's annals, was used to vindicate her reputation and confirm the couple's marriage under church law. The trial was painful, humiliating, and terrifying, but in her case, it was exonerating. Symbolism and theology. To the medieval mind, the ordeal was not barbarous, it was sacred. It reflected God's justice, immediate and visible. It was a public spectacle, reinforcing community norms and divine hierarchy. It combined Old Testament echoes, fire, water, divine judgment with Christian sacraments. Yet not all clergy were comfortable. Some began to question. Could pain truly reflect truth? Was God obligated to act when summoned? Could a sinner survive an ordeal by mere chance? These questions sowed the seeds for reform. The limits of divine justice. In practice, ordeals were never wholly predictable. Clergy often interpreted ambiguous results in line with local politics or expectations. In some cases, the ordeal was rigged, the iron cooled slightly, the water temperature moderated. In others, clerical pressure swayed the outcome regardless of evidence. The ideal of divine justice clashed with human fallibility. As church theology grew more sophisticated and legal culture more literate, ordeals began to feel like an embarrassment to canon law. If justice belongs to God, can it ever be reliably measured by human ritual? Or must humanity build a system of law that does not rely on miracles at all? It is the early 13th century. A church council has gathered in Rome, its halls echoing with the Latin chants of clerics. But amid the liturgical prayers, a question arises that will quietly unsettle centuries of justice. Should the church continue to bless the fire that burns, the water that scalds, and the rituals that test God? We explore how the church itself began to wrestle with the theology of the ordeal. No longer taken for granted, the ordeal system faced scrutiny not only from skeptical minds, but from a changing church that sought to reform itself from within. Theology turns inward, the church's growing doubts. By the High Middle Ages, theology had become increasingly intellectualized. Canon lawyers, theologians, and scholastics began questioning many aspects of church practice, ordeals among them. Several arguments emerged. Presumption upon God. If a priest blesses the ordeal, is he not forcing God's hand? What if God chooses not to act? Would the church be complicit in condemning the innocent? Inconsistency. Some accused were acquitted through ordeal despite being clearly guilty by other measures. Others were condemned when community knowledge suggested their innocence. Contradiction with mercy. The ordeal could leave people maimed or dead. Yet Christianity preached forgiveness and repentance. How did physical punishment align with spiritual healing? These critiques were not radical, they came from within the church's own councils and schools. Notably, the theologian Peter the Chanter of Paris wrote around 1200. God does not always reveal justice through signs. We must not tempt the Lord with rituals that bind his will. This growing discomfort would soon manifest in church policy. The Fourth Lateran Council, 1215, a turning point. In 1215, Pope Innocent III convened the Fourth Lateran Council, one of the most significant church gatherings of the medieval era. Amid sweeping reforms on clerical behavior, sacraments, and heresy, the council quietly but decisively withdrew church support from trials by ordeal. It declared, "Clerics shall no longer take part in ordeals or be present at their celebration." This decree may sound minor, but it had enormous effects. Without priests to bless the water or iron, the ordeal lost its sacred legitimacy. Civil authorities could not claim divine justice without ecclesiastical participation. Over time, the ordeal faded as an acceptable judicial procedure across Christian Europe. This decision marked the formal severing of justice from divine spectacle. From now on, legal judgment would need to find new toolstones based in evidence, reason, or at least structured inquiry. Secular responses, hesitation, and resistance. The church's retreat from ordeal practice did not eliminate the practice overnight. In England, for example, ordeals were common in royal courts well into the early 13th century. But by the 1220s, following the Lateran Council's decision, English judges could no longer compel clerical participation. In 1219, under King Henry III, the royal courts issued instructions replacing the ordeal with jury trials, a monumental shift. Thus began the rise of the common law jury system, where local men swore to investigate and testify on the facts of a case. In Germany, some areas continued ordeal practices longer, especially in remote or rural territories, where older customs endured despite ecclesiastical discouragement. In Scandinavia, ordeals persisted in localized forms, though they gradually gave way to hybrid systems of oaths and community arbitration. The rise of the jury and the inquisitorial process. With ordeals in retreat, new legal systems emerged. Magnifying glass-tilted right jury trials, Anglo-Norman system. Groups of local men, often 12, were summoned to testify on a case. These were not impartial jurors as in modern courts, but were expected to have knowledge of the case or the parties involved. The role was investigatory as well as deliberative. This system evolved into trial by peers, an early step toward more recognizable legal standards. Scroll inquisitorial procedure, continental Europe. Influenced by Roman law and canon law traditions. Investigators, often church-appointed, gathered testimony and evidence through interviews and sworn statements. Emphasis was placed on documentation, written confessions, and legal expertise. This model informed not only church courts, but also royal legal systems in France, Italy, and Spain. These developments were imperfect, often biased, and vulnerable to corruption, but they replaced divine signs with human inquiry, a profound shift in judicial thinking. Memory and myth, ordeals in folklore and literature. Even as legal systems changed, the ordeal remained vivid in cultural memory. In medieval literature, the trial by combat was a common motive symbolizing honor, truth, and divine favor. Women accused of adultery or witchcraft were portrayed as facing tests of fire or water, often with miraculous escapes or tragic deaths. Saints' lives often featured ordeals survived by holy intervention, such as St. Agnes walking unscathed through flame. In the imagination, the ordeal never quite died. It lived on in fairy tales, ballads, and legends, long after it left the courtroom. Exceptions and echoes, witch trials and late ordeals. Though the Church officially rejected ordeal practices, some resurfaced during periods of panic. In the late medieval and early modern witch trials, courts sometimes threw accused witches into water to see if they would float, a variant of the cold water ordeal. Sought physical signs like witches' marks as proof, reminiscent of older beliefs in divine evidence on the body. These trials were often led by secular courts, but carried echoes of earlier church rituals even if distorted. Even in these dark episodes, however, the rational legal structures born in the 13th century imposed some limits, and over time, helped end such practices altogether. Was the end of the ordeal the beginning of true justice? Or did it simply replace divine fire with fallible men still searching, still uncertain? A dusty legal code sits unopened in an archive. Its pages speak of fire, iron, and oaths before altars, rituals once believed to be divine paths to truth. Those rituals are long gone, but their imprint remains, not only in forgotten documents but in how we understand justice, punishment, and belief. As we conclude this story, we'll trace how the ideals, fears, and logic of the ordeal shaped the emergence of modern legal institutions and moral frameworks. From the embers of trial by ordeal arose new structures that still carry the shadow of their fiery origins. A world after the ordeal. The formal end of the ordeal in most of Europe by the mid-13th century did not eliminate the desire for certainty and justice, nor the need for public rituals of guilt and innocence. Instead, the church and secular governments began building systems of law that offered structured processes less dramatic, but more stable. Canon law courts handled marriage, morality, and ecclesiastical disputes with increasingly documented and procedural models. Royal courts codified practices into statutes and precedents, particularly in England, where common law grew steadily in complexity. Inquisitorial systems on the continent established mechanisms for testimony, evidence evaluation, and legal representational debate still within hierarchical frameworks. These systems began to separate the sacred from the judicial, though never entirely. The lingering spirit of ritual justice. Despite procedural reforms, medieval justice retained a theatrical character. Trials were held publicly, often on market days or feast days, to maximize communal impact. Punishments, flogging, branding, execution, remained public and symbolic. Even jury oaths retained religious language, "So help me God." The psychological power of earlier ordeal swear, the entire community witnessed divine truth, made manifest still influenced expectations about law and order. People wanted not just fair outcomes, but visible, memorable justice, moral certainty, and the burden of proof. The ordeal was built on a presumption of divine truth. Its demise left a void. If we could not ask God directly, how could we ever be sure? Legal systems had to develop concepts of evidence and standards of proof, including presumption of innocence, requirement of corroborating witnesses, rules against hearsay, judicial discretion based on context. These principles emerged slowly, unevenly, and sometimes only partially, but they marked a shift from justice as divine revelation to justice as reasoned probability. The notion that truth must be proven rather than revealed was itself revolutionary. The Church's role in legal evolution. Ironically, the very Church that once blessed boiling cauldrons became a major architect of rational legal thought. Canon law schools, especially in Bologna and Paris, produced generations of legal scholars. The decretals of Pope Gregory IX, 1230s, became a foundational legal text, systematizing church law with clarity and coherence. Clerical judges developed principles of due process, appeal, and legal rights that influenced secular courts across Europe. In time, even secular jurists like Gratian and Bracton built upon church teachings, forging the intellectual backbone of European legal traditions. The ordeal was abandoned, but in its place, the Church left a deeper legacy, the idea that law must be systematic, teachable, and humane. Ordeal's afterlife in modern law and culture. Even in today's world, echoes of the ordeal can be found. Lie detector tests and forensic truth serums promise to reveal guilt without confession, reflecting a desire for infallible judgment. Media trials and public opinion often seek moral spectacle, reminiscent of medieval crowds gathering around the ordeal pit. Some authoritarian regimes have staged trials with predetermined outcomes, evoking the ritual certainty of ordeal without divine reference. In fiction, we return again and again to themes of tests of character. In courtroom dramas, the truth is revealed under pressure, almost like a modern fire. In fantasy and myth, heroes must undergo ordeals to prove purity or divine favor. These tropes endure because the basic human desire remains: to know, beyond all doubt, who is guilty and who is not. Lessons from the Age of Ordeal. What can the Age of Ordeal teach us, despite its pain and superstition? Communal justice is powerful. Ordeals gave communities a shared moment of judgment, public, binding, and emotional. Law reflects belief. As faith in divine justice waned, law had to evolve new tools and procedures. Legal systems are mirrors of cultural values. Certainty is rare. The ordeal promised certainty but could not deliver it. Modern systems, for all their flaws, accept ambiguity and seek fairness over finality. Justice is a journey. The transition from fire to reason took centuries. It reminds us that every generation must wrestle with how to balance truth, power, and mercy. Can we ever fully leave behind the yearning for divine justice? Or does some part of us still hope that, in moments of doubt, the fire might speak? Story 6. The Monastic Economy: How Monks Managed Wealth and Labor. It is just before dawn. Bells echo across the cloister. A monk rises from his straw pallet and steps into the cold stone corridor. Today, like every day, he will pray, chant, and were not just in scripture, but in the fields, kitchens, and scriptorium. This is not only a house of God, it is a center of labor, production, and economy. We begin our journey into the quiet yet remarkably sophisticated world of medieval monastic economics. The cloister may appear still and austere, but within its walls lay a powerful engine of wealth creation, land management, and economic innovation. The origins of monastic life. Monasticism in Western Europe grew from late Roman Christian traditions of asceticism and withdrawal from worldly life. But it was Benedict of Nursia, in the 6th century, who formalized the structure that would dominate for centuries. His rule of Saint Benedict became the blueprint for daily structure, a balance of prayer, manual labor, and rest. Community life. Monks lived together under an abbot, owning nothing personally. Stability. A monk swore to remain within his monastery for life. Importantly, Benedict wrote, "Idleness is the enemy of the soul." Thus, labor, not just contemplation, became central. And over time, this labor gave rise to organized economic activity. Monasteries as landowners. From the 7th century onward, monasteries became major recipients of land donations. Noble families gave land in exchange for spiritual benefits, prayers for their souls, burial in sacred grounds, and alliances with the church. Some kings granted monasteries vast estates to support missionary work or political alliances. Over generations, these gifts accumulated into landed estates stretching across counties or even kingdoms. Each monastery acted as a landlord, overseeing fields for grain and vegetables, orchards and vineyards, mills and fish ponds, tenant farms run by lay peasants or serfs. The monks themselves rarely worked all the land. Instead, they supervised a complex system of labor, rent, and obligations from surrounding communities. Daily economic life within the cloister. Inside the monastery, the rhythm of work was carefully ordered. Kitchen monks prepared meals from internal stores and garden produce. Cellars managed food, wine, and provisions effectively. The monastery's supply officers. Sacristans oversaw church linens, candles, and sacred vessels. Scriptorium monks copied manuscripts, sometimes producing highly valuable illuminated texts for trade or donation. Infirmarians managed the sick, using herbal remedies from the cloister garden. Guest masters welcomed pilgrims and visitors, coordinating supplies and shelter. Everything from soap making to metalwork could take place within the walls. The monastery was self-sufficient and in many cases economically independent. The lay brothers, monastic labor in the fields. By the 11th century, many monasteries developed the role of lay brothers, conversi. Men who took monastic vows but focused on manual labor, not liturgical duties. They managed plowing, harvesting, herding, and tool maintenance. This allowed choir monks to maintain their liturgical schedule while still adhering to the Benedictine emphasis on labor. The lay brother system allowed monasteries to expand their agricultural output significantly, turning them into centers of rural production. Specialization and innovation. Monastic communities began to specialize based on local resources and regional demand. Monasteries in Burgundy became renowned for viticulture and wine production. Those in England and Ireland focused on sheep and wool, a major export. Others produced salt, iron tools, parchment, or ale, depending on geography. In some cases, monasteries pioneered new technologies. Watermills for grinding grain and operating bellows. Irrigation systems and drainage for improving farmland. Architectural innovations in stonework and vaulting that would later influence cathedral builders. Though cloistered from the world, monks often managed it with remarkable efficiency. Monasteries and trade. While monks were not merchants, they participated in trade indirectly. Surpluses of grain, wine, or wool were sold to local markets or merchants. Monasteries often hired lay agents to handle commercial exchange. Urban monasteries owned rented houses and workshops, collecting income from city dwellers. Some even operated guest houses or hospitals that brought income from donations or noble patronage. In regions like Lombardy or Flanders, Monastic lands were part of international trade networks, supplying wool to Italy or grain to urbanizing cities. Charity and redistribution. A key purpose of monastic wealth was almsgiving. Daily handouts of bread, ale, or soup were offered at the gates. On feast days or during famines, larger distributions occurred. Some monasteries ran leper hospitals or poorhouses as acts of service. While monks were landowners and economic managers, their moral justification for wealth rested on generosity, hospitality, and charity. Yet tensions grew. Was this wealth truly for God's glory or for the monastery's prestige? The growing complexity of monastic estates. As estates grew, so did record-keeping and bureaucracy. Monks kept detailed ledgers of rents, produce, labor owed, and taxes paid. Latin account books tracked harvests, land leases, and financial gifts. Monasteries sometimes lent money or acted as intermediaries for noble families managing inheritances. A typical abbey might oversee dozens of manors, each with its own steward and tithe barn. Monks who once prayed in solitude now ran complex economic networks, comparable in scope to noble households or early civic institutions. Behind the cloister walls had monks built a kingdom not just of heaven, but of earthly abundance. Could a life of poverty and prayer coexist with property and power? The bell tower rises above the surrounding fields. From its height, a monk might gaze across acres of grain, clusters of vineyards, and tenant villages beyond. But this wealth is not without consequence. In the stillness of prayer, questions begin to surface about stewardship, greed, and whether the monastery has grown too rich for its own soul. We follow the evolution of the monastic economy from organized spiritual labor into an intricate, sometimes conflicted system of feudal wealth and management. We will explore how monks grappled with their rising economic influence and how that power began to shift their role within medieval society. The manor system and feudal relationships. By the 12th century, most large monasteries managed their lands through the manorial system, economic backbone of feudal society. Each manor was a self-contained estate comprising a demesne farmed directly for the monastery's use, tenant holding smaller plots worked by peasants or serfs who paid rent in labor or produce, common lands pastures or woods shared under regulated conditions. Monks oversaw these estates through stewards, often lay officials trained in accountancy and land management. The result was a network of semi-autonomous manors, each producing goods and services for both the monastery and local markets. Monastic estates became so vast that abbeys like Cluny in France or Fountains Abbey in England controlled dozens of manors, some located days apart. This level of management required detailed inventory records, regular visits by monastic officials, systems of justice and arbitration for tenant disputes. Though rooted in prayer, monasteries had become economic hubs rivaling noble lords in both land and influence. The Cistercian model, simplicity and expansion. A significant development came in the late 11th and early 12th centuries with the rise of the Cistercian order. Founded in 1098 at Sidaux, the Cistercians sought to return to Benedictine simplicity, rejecting ornate decoration and excessive wealth. Establish remote monasteries far from cities and noble entanglements. Focus on manual labor, particularly agriculture, managed by lay brothers. Cistercian abbeys, such as Revaux and Clairvaux, quickly became renowned for efficient land use, rational estate management, expansive wool production, especially in England. Their success, ironically, brought immense wealth. Despite initial vows of poverty, Cistercian houses by the 13th century controlled huge estates and even operated export businesses through merchant partners. Their story illustrates a central paradox. The more efficiently monks followed the rule, the more their wealth hand its temptations grew. Abbeys as employers and economic anchors. Monasteries did not only rely on tenant labor, they also employed craftsmen, blacksmiths, stonemasons, weavers, coopers, carters, and millers, essential to transportation and grain processing. Bookbinders and scribes, especially in intellectual centers like Monte Cassino or St. Gall. Some monasteries maintained large building programs, offering sustained employment for local populations. Their presence also benefited towns, which developed near abbey gates to service pilgrim traffic and trade. Markets often held under monastic jurisdiction, bringing together merchants and farmers. Thus, monasteries became economic ecosystems, integrating rural, artisanal, and spiritual economies under one roof. Conflicts with local nobility and secular power. This economic clout sometimes placed monasteries in conflict with lords and kings. Common tensions included tax exemptions. Many abbeys were free from secular taxes, frustrating neighboring nobles. Jurisdictional disputes. Monks often claimed the right to administer justice on their lands, a privilege resented by royal officials. Land encroachments. Nobles occasionally tried to seize abbey land during times of war or political turmoil. Monasteries defended themselves with charters, legal documents confirming privileges, often sealed by popes or monarchs. Appeals to Rome. Abbots could petition the pope for protection or redress. Diplomatic alliances, hosting noble children as oblate monks or spiritual clients. Some abbots even became political advisors or royal confessors, giving monasteries a voice in court affairs. Internal struggles, reform, wealth, and spiritual decline. By the late 13th century, criticisms of monastic wealth began to grow louder, often from within the church itself. Reform movements argued that lavish church buildings, fine meals, and silverware betrayed the ideal of poverty. That monks were too removed from manual labor, delegating it to lay brothers or serfs. That abbots had become aristocrats, more concerned with rents than souls. Literary works echoed this critique. The satirical monk in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales hunts instead of praying, dresses finely, and ignores monastic duties. These concerns led to renewed calls for reform, especially from newer mendicant orders like the Franciscans and Dominicans. Visitations, church officials inspecting monasteries for adherence to the rule. Suppression or absorption of small, decaying abbeys into larger ones. Still, despite critiques, monastic communities continued to serve as anchors of economic life, education, and charity throughout the medieval period. Can those who renounce the world truly remain untouched by its riches? Or does the very act of managing the world's labor shape the soul as much as prayer? The monastery is quiet, its scriptorium is empty, moss creeps up the cloister walls and the fields lie fallow. What was once a buzzing center of economy, learning, and labor is now a relic. The monastic economy, like all human systems, rose, flourished, and declined. Yet even in decline, it shaped the world that followed. We explore the gradual unraveling of monastic economic dominance, the pressureless internal and external that brought about change, and the enduring legacy left by these once powerful spiritual landlords. Economic stresses and external pressures. By the 14th century, monastic wealth had peaked in much of Western Europe, but it also faced new strains. The Black Death, 1347–1351, devastated populations, reducing labor supplies and rent income. Peasants demanded higher wages or freedom from obligations undermining the traditional manorial structure. Military conflicts such as the 100 Years' War disrupted rural economies and destroyed monastic lands. Inflation and currency instability further complicated monastic accounting and provisioning. Monasteries, dependent on predictable rents and stable manpower, struggled to adapt. Many had to lease lands to tenant farmers instead of managing them directly, sell off distant manors to cover expenses, reduce charitable outlays, and cut back on construction or manuscript copying. The monastic economy, built for stability and surplus, had difficulty managing uncertainty and volatility, internal decay, and calls for reform. While external pressures mounted, internal issues weakened the fabric of monastic life. Many houses had become comfortable rather than austere, enjoying privileges inconsistent with vows of poverty. Spiritual routines were disrupted by estate management, political appointments, and legal disputes. Lay brothers declined in number, forcing monasteries to outsource labor, distancing themselves from Benedictine ideals. By the late Middle Ages, critics both inside and outside the church viewed monasteries as land hoarders, more concerned with rents than souls. Elitist institutions, admitting mostly noble sons who saw it as a career path. Financially opaque, using charitable language to justify wealthy lifestyles. Movements such as the Devotio Moderna and later Protestant Reformation found fertile ground in these discontents. The dissolution of monasteries. The most dramatic end came not from within, but from state intervention, particularly in England. Between 1536 and 1541, Henry VIII ordered the dissolution of the monasteries, seizing over 800 religious houses, tens of thousands of acres of land, enormous quantities of gold, silver plate, livestock, and rents. His motives were political, theological, and financial. Break with Rome and the Pope. Seize monastic wealth for the crown. Redistribute lands to create a loyal gentry class. The economic shock was immense. Monastic hospitals, schools, and almshouses vanished almost overnight. Vast rural estates were absorbed into private hands. Other countries followed suit in varying degrees. France suppressed monastic orders during the Revolution. Germany secularized church lands during the Napoleonic Wars. Italy and Spain curtailed or nationalized monastic properties in the 19th century. The once stable monastic estate system had largely vanished from public life. Surviving orders and modern adaptations. Despite widespread dissolution, some monasteries survived or re-emerged. The Benedictines, Cistercians, and Trappists maintained continuity, often in smaller, reformed communities. In modern times, these orders adapted by producing cheese, beer, wine, and chocolate for income, running retreat centers, guest houses, and spiritual workshops, operating schools, colleges, or theological seminaries. Today, monastic orders still preserve ancient rhythms of prayer and labor, though no longer as dominant landowners or rural managers. Their role is more contemplative, their footprint smaller, but their cultural and economic legacy endures. Legacy, what the monastic economy left behind. Despite its decline, the monastic economy made lasting contributions to Western society. 1. Agricultural innovation. Monks improved soil, drainage, crop rotation, and livestock management methods that endured into modern farming. 2. Bureaucratic efficiency. Their record-keeping and estate management inspired later secular administrators and state officials. 3. Charitable infrastructure. Hospitals, guest houses, poor relief systems, and educational institutions laid the groundwork for public services. 4. Preservation of knowledge. Monastic scriptoria preserved not just religious texts, but also classical and scientific works. 5. Spiritual economic synthesis. Monks demonstrated that spiritual life need not reject work, a model that continues to influence religious and secular philosophies of labor. The quiet echo of labor and prayer. Though the great abbeys may now be ruins visited by tourists rather than pilgrims, ideals and contradictions of monastic economy still speak to us. The monks believed that every act of labor, from cleaning fish ponds to copying psalms, could be a form of devotion. That belief gave dignity to work and structure to communities for centuries. But it also raised eternal questions. Can wealth and holiness truly coexist? When does stewardship become ownership? How does labor serve both the body and the soul? In a world striving for productivity and balance, is there still something to learn from the silent rhythms of monks who once ruled the fields with prayer in their hands?